Hello everyone, welcome to week 9 of Sustainability in Society. Another great lesson for you this week. Let's go ahead and take a quick overview of the content. So we are here week 9, but lesson 8. You can start off with, I think, a really nice short video here that goes a little beyond what most people think of as sustainable buildings. And it's kind of a burgeoning movement in the buildings industry and the sustainability world in general to move from just sustainable and green, which I have a lot of issues with that term, but because it sort of has it's used so much that it doesn't have much meaning anymore. But sustainable buildings moving toward regenerative buildings. So it's a really great video here that's kind of summarizes some of these concepts, in particular the benefits of biomimicry and biophilia, which is basically the benefits that having access to nature has for humans and for their health and for the natural environment. So starting to take a watch. It's like a 6 or 7 minute video. So this week we're doing sustainable buildings, and so this is another one of those lessons where we could go spend a whole semester working on something like this because it's such a big topic and there are just so many different sustainable buildings out there. Again, we're just kind of dipping our toes here, as it were, into the sustainable building world. But we start off with some passive solar design concepts. And passive solar design is really just a way to use the natural environment to minimize your energy use. That's really what it boils down to. So if you think about it, buildings, why do we use buildings? Obviously we need shelter from the elements, but we spend so much time of our lives in buildings, something like 90 to 95% of our lives inside of buildings, believe it or not. Most of us do anyway. And so with buildings, what we have this tendency to do is just plop a building down, put up some walls and a roof and all that sort of thing, and then just control the climate using heating and cooling systems. And so what passive design does is it modifies that model and considers the ambient conditions, so like which direction the sunlight's coming from, which direction the wind's coming from, and so forth. And using those ambient conditions, so when you build a building, you design it at the beginning to take advantage of those local climatic conditions. And if you do this properly, it's actually relatively low tech. Design principles for the most part, like orientation and windows and some shading and so forth. As you'll see in some of these readings, they've known about this, or humans have known about this for literally thousands of years. And you see some examples of ancient buildings in this article where hundreds and thousands of years ago they were taking advantage of these design principles. And so in some ways, we're kind of there's a movement to kind of get back to that, something that we as humans understood and took advantage of, a long time ago. So that's what passive design is. It's using the local conditions to reduce your energy use by taking advantage primarily of sunlight, but also to a lesser extent wind. And so you read, a summary of that. And then, as I said, there's a reading here about some ancient uses of these principles. And then there's a video here, which is a really interesting sort of custom-built passive home. And you'll see a couple of different, actually all of these principles that you go over here, all of these passive design principles are integrated into this one house in a really interesting way. And they use some interesting building materials like cob, which is just basically clay and straw and maybe some sand. But also, believe it or not, part of the walls of this house, as you'll see, are made of straw bales. So actual bales of straw, which are it's a natural, really good insulator. And you can actually, basically build the walls out of that with a little bit extra framing. Anyway, so this video is really interesting. It integrates a lot of these passive house principles into it. And then, of course, I provide a summary. And then we get into some really common the most common green, quote unquote, green or sustainable building metric is LEED. And I'm sure you've heard of LEED before. I imagine you have anyway. LEED here. So there are LEED buildings all over the place, including on the Delaware Tech campus. On all of the campuses, there's LEED buildings. But the premise behind LEED is if you have a building and you want to figure out, okay, how sustainable is this building? And how can I compare the sustainability of this building to the sustainability of another building? Because as I'm sure you've gathered by this point, there's a lot to sustainability, right? We could look at water, we could look at energy, we could look at food, we could look at materials, we could look at equity, we could look at energy. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff to look at for sustainability. So how do we measure the overall sustainability of a building? So you need a rating system. And so that's what LEED is. It's a sustainable rating system. And as you'll see, you basically you get points. It's a point-based system. You get points for different sustainability aspects in your building. And then they give you a rating based on your point total. All right. So you'll see, an overview of what LEED is and how it works. Again, this is really, really common. If you look at the LEED, or the U.S. Green Building Council, this who oversees LEED. If you look at their website, there are thousands of these buildings all over the world. Okay, so this is the most common sustainability rating system out there. There are a number of others, but LEED is the most common. And then we'll go over the Living Building Challenge, which is it's less common. You don't see as many of these buildings out there. There's only a handful of these in the world, actually, because it's a really, really robust. It is the most robust, sustainable, holistic, sustainable rating system in the world today. And so this is something that it's not as I said, not as common, but you'll see that to get a full living building certification, you need to address all the aspects of sustainability that we've discussed throughout the semester, and actually more that we haven't discussed yet. So everything from water to energy to equity to beauty to food, to ecosystem management. It's everything all into one. And so we'll go over living building certification as well, and a couple of case studies or examples of living buildings. And then we'll finish off with a couple of sort of some that are actually becoming more common. So that if you're familiar with tiny homes, it sounds kind of like a silly, designation, but this is actually something that's become much more common, especially as housing prices have increased recently. So there's, if you're into this whole thing, there's shows on tiny homes, and you can find all kinds of information about tiny homes out there. But this is a really interesting solution to these giant houses that we don't use, most of the space, and they're really expensive, and the energy is expensive, and the resource use is high. And so with a tiny house, it's basically a small house. Usually it's on wheels, so you can actually move to different locations if you need to. So it just cuts down on resource use and energy use. And another thing that it does, it minimizes the amount of stuff that we have. So going back to our consumption and materialism lesson, by necessity, you have less stuff in a smaller house. And so it also you end up usually spending more time outside and so forth. Anyway, tiny homes are something that are all over the place. And then here's just an example of a tiny home village in Colorado that they use to house the homeless. There's actually tiny home villages. There's one in Delaware. These are all over the place. It's another nice aspect of these. It's a potential solution to homelessness as well, or a partial solution anyway. And then in this video, I also go over cooperative housing, and a couple of examples of cooperative housing, which are shared housing, right? So the idea behind cooperative housing is most people live in these giant homes and they don't use most of the space most of the time. And so what you can do is sort of share your housing with other people. And then you have less square footage per person, but you sort of have more shared spaces and shared resources, and there's some other aspects to this as well. But they're usually these very sort of communal environments where one of the points of cooperative housing is sort of develop community and kind of go back to the having stronger communities as opposed to these like single-family homes where you're all spread out and there's less interaction. So this facilitates interaction and community development. So that's cooperative housing. Again, there's cooperative housing all over the place. It's generally a lot more prominent in a lot of other countries like Europe, like European countries, excuse me. But there's a lot in the U.S. as well. Up the road in Philadelphia, there's cooperative housing, and a lot of places utilize this. So that's just something that's it does address sustainability in a couple of different ways. All right, so that is the overview of this week, and of course you have your regular question set. I think this is another really interesting topic, something it is accessible, it's out there, and if you keep your eye out, there's all kinds of sustainable buildings all over the place. So hopefully this will give you a good sense of some of the common ways to make a building more sustainable. Okay, that's it, and I hope you enjoy the content.